nerds, what's up? Welcome to my new series where I discuss the life and accomplishments of seminal authors in the fantasy and science fiction genre. And since we just finished spooky season, I thought who would be a better person to start with than Mary Shelley, famed author of Frankenstein and often cited as the forgotten mother of science fiction. Today we are going to discuss her life, which is honestly a little bit wild. I was not prepared. We're going to discuss her works, her legacy, and why she might be considered as forgotten. And we are going to start from the very beginning. Mary Shelley was born in London on August 30th of 1797 to the parents Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, is a famed feminist, writing what's often considered one of the first pieces of feminist literature in 1792, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. She was obviously also a writer and advocated fiercely for the educational equality of women. Ultimately, she died in complications when giving birth to Mary. Now, her father, William Godwin, was a philosopher, journalist, atheist, and anarchist. He was also an avid writer and wrote a lot of influential pieces on the aforementioned topics. Both her parents were well connected to other famous writers, including people like William Wordsworth, and it is known that Mary Shelley also had access to these people. So right off the bat, we have Mary born to two parents who are radical thinkers, free thinkers, and authors. I think that obviously clearly shaped who she would become. Her early life was a little tumultuous. It's known that when her father remarried, Mary and her stepmother had a very complicated relationship that wasn't necessarily good. And in fact, her stepmother sent her stepsister, Claire, to be educated and did not send Mary to be formally educated. Mary also had a few other step-siblings that lived with her. She had one sister that was the result of her biological mother's earlier affair, two siblings that her stepmother brought to the new marriage, including Claire, who I previously mentioned, and then later a brother born to her father and stepmother. Claire is a step-sibling of note simply because a lot of Mary's life involved Claire being with her. During this time, Mary supposedly was known to love to read and write, and we know this mostly from letters and journals that were compiled into a work in the year 1889 called The Life and Letters of Mary Shelley, so it is a pretty good source in general. Now, it doesn't take long for Mary's life to get interesting because it got interesting very young. In 1814, at only 16 years old, she met Percy Shelley. Percy Shelley was 21, a mentee of her father's, and also married. They had an affair, Mary got pregnant, and they ran away together along with her stepsister Claire. It should be noted that Percy's wife was also pregnant at the time. Now, a quick pin in this story to talk about Percy Shelley, since he will become important in Mary's life. Percy Shelley was a poet who ended up not really being recognized by his contemporaries, but has now since been recognized as an important influence in terms of romantic poets. So again, another writer in Mary's life. Mary gave birth to that child by Percy Shelley that unfortunately did not survive very long after the birth. And in 1816, 2 years after they had run away together, Percy Shelley's wife actually took her own life. And then later that same year, Mary and Percy wed together themselves. So yeah, that's kind of a lot in my opinion. 1816 would prove to be a very eventful year in Mary Shelley's life because it was also during that year that her, Percy, and her stepsister Claire were staying with a friend, Lord Byron, at his manor. And during a spooky night, they were encouraged to write their own ghost stories. This was motivated by all of their love for a ghost story collection called Phantasmagoriana, which I probably said wrong. It was a German story collection. This is, of course, when Mary Shelley wrote the story that would eventually become Frankenstein at only 18 years old. So Frankenstein was published only 2 years later in 1818 when Mary was 20 years old, and it was published under the original title, Frankenstein, A Modern Prometheus. Now, Mary didn't initially put her name on the book. She was worried about its kind of controversial topics, but her husband had written an introduction for the story, and her father wrote a dedication. So at the time, a lot of readers thought one of those two men had written the story since her name wasn't attached to it. Now, Frankenstein became an instant success among readers. Like immediately, history shows that people loved this story. In fact, by the time she republished the story 4 years later in 1822, this time with some minor edits and her name attached, a theatrical production had already been produced of the novel. However, that same year, 1822, would see tragedy strike Mary again when her husband Percy passed away. Now, at this point in time, Mary had given birth 4 times, but 3 of her children had already passed away. One in 1815, one in 1818, and one in 1819. Only one of her 4 children with Percy would survive to adulthood. Mary never ended up remarrying, and she did spend a lot of her time trying to promote her deceased husband's poetry and other written works. Mary also wrote a few other novels in her lifetime, although none obviously as famous as Frankenstein. In 1823, she released Valperga, or The Life and Adventures of Castruccio, Prince of the Lucca, and it was a historical fiction. In 1826, she released The Last Man, probably her other most famous work, as it is often considered a landmark, apocalyptic, and dystopian novel. In 1830, she released The Fortunes of Perkins Warbeck, a romance, which was another historical fiction. In 1835, she published Lodore, and in 1837, her last novel while she was alive, Faulkner, a novel. Mary Shelley died in 1851 at only 53 years old. One novel of hers, Mathilda, was published posthumously. I want to talk a little bit about Mary Shelley's legacy. Now, obviously, if you look up just Halloween monsters, Frankenstein's monster, as we know, is always going to appear. It is synonymous with Halloween in the way that vampires are, and ghosts, and mummies. Like, it is one of our main Halloween monsters. It's also a source of over 45 movies, some of them being direct adaptations, or spoofs, or just inspired bys, and the first was produced all the way back in 1910. It's inspired novels, plays, and music, and the famous character has been mentioned or referenced in too many things to count. According to Guinness World Records, in 2021, Mary Shelley also became the most expensive book sold by a female author, with a first edition of Frankenstein going for $1.17 million at auction. One of the most interesting things about Frankenstein's legacy to me is how much of the original novel and ideas within that novel have been lost in the pop cultureification of it. I remember when I read this several years ago, my only ideas of Frankenstein were that it was like some sort of ambling monster, and the idea of it's alive. Like, I said that in my original review. And so I was shocked at this novel that was so philosophical and dealt so much with these themes of what happens when you give someone godlike power, what makes someone human, what kind of emotions, who is the actual monster. Like, those things really surprised me. And it's been a further surprise because I read Dracula actually for the first time this year by Bram Stoker, obviously another super famous classic Halloween novel, and I was expecting some similar things, but instead I actually feel like most of the things in Dracula have translated pretty directly to our pop culture knowledge of Dracula. And so it's very interesting how that is different from Mary Shelley's work. Obviously, one of the big things is that we call the monster Frankenstein a lot. Now, I will say in the last decade, there has been this huge push that it's not Frankenstein, but Frankenstein's monster. So I do feel like that's lesser now, but I still think it would really surprise people how philosophical the work is. In learning more about Mary's life for this video, I actually felt like I got a little window into how Mary Shelley would have been uniquely suited to write this type of monster story. She was surrounded by writers and philosophers, and she had so much tragedy in her life, especially surrounding death, that I see how these elements would come together to write a novel that explores the ideas of death and rebirth and cruelty and philosophizes on so many big topics. Like, I think when you view her life, not that I think we should always make some direct one-to-one, but I think there are some very clear influences. As far as Mary Shelley being the forgotten mother of sci-fi, I do think a little bit like the pop cultureification of Frankenstein, we are seeing the pendulum swing the other way. In fact, just as recently as 2017, a dramatic biopic movie was made of her life titled Mary Shelley. And despite the fact that it bombed in every measure, it was created, right? Like, Mary Shelley was starting to become like this known person we were trying to remember. I think this reputation as the forgotten mother really came around because for a while there, anytime an article was written about the inception of the sci-fi genre, her name just wouldn't be there, and instead they would favor other authors who were writing after her time. Like, in particular, I noticed they would mention Jules Verne. Now, the reason I wanted to bring this topic up is I do think in my research, talking about the inception of genres is very difficult. And I think sci-fi in general poses even more of a difficulty than fantasy, because fantasy is in some ways a broader topic. I mean, I think already we struggle sometimes delineating the line between fantasy and sci-fi, but fantasy feels bigger. Sci-fi feels like it has a few more roles to be considered science fiction. And in fact, while I was researching, some people claimed things like, can science fiction really be considered a genre before modern science was a thing? Is anything that mentioned the heavens and space considered sci-fi, or does it have to be rooted in real scientific principles? And those questions, unfortunately, aren't going to always have a concrete answer because they will be different for everybody. But in general, I think we view sci-fi as a more modern genre. There's not going to be something like a Beowulf, which was written, centuries before and was one of the first stories we've ever had. Fantasy is just a little easier to define in some ways. Overall, like Tolkien and the fantasy genre, I don't think it's so much as the birth of all of these types of stories, but rather the birth of the genre as we consider it today. And in that case, Mary Shelley really is the first person writing the things that we view as sci-fi today. But I do think she's getting her flowers now, and I am very glad for it. I personally had such a good time getting to know Mary Shelley a little bit more, and if you haven't read Frankenstein, I highly recommend it. I enjoyed it a lot, and like I said, it'll probably be a very different novel than you're expecting if you don't know a lot about it. I'm also planning on doing other authors, so if you have recommendations for me, I'm not going to say I'm going to take them. You can put them below. I do have a list of people I am interested in, but I hope you like this kind of exploration of authors. I think it's always interesting to get to know their history, and if you like these kind of deep dives and videos, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.